please join me in welcoming Professor Andy Whiten.
Thank you, Mark. Sadly, I don't play golf. Yeah. Professors don't have time. Okay, so here's what I'm going to talk about. My title is Animal Cultures, or How Animal Culture Extends the Scope of Biology, which obviously corresponds with the title of this two-day cycloquium, which we're in the middle of. What I mean by biology is simply the science of life. And so this question really is, well, how does what we've discovered about what we're calling animal culture extend our understanding of life on this planet? So what do I mean by animal culture? What is culture? Well, we sometimes think of culture, certainly if we read a Sunday paper in the UK, as something to do with the theatre and the opera and the ballet, but that's really high art. What we mean by culture, and the kind of culture we're talking at this meeting, is really everything we learn from others that endures for long enough to be thought of as a tradition. And it pervades every aspect of human life. So things like the way we dress, the customs we follow. And of course, culture evolves in different ways in different parts of the world. So we wear different things. We speak different languages. We have different technologies. The man up there with the bow and arrow is just one little example of the way in which our culture includes really all our material inventions. I mean, everything in this room is the result of human culture. It includes the things we like to eat, the way we cook them, and the way we actually eat them. So, as humans, culture pervades our lives. But what we've learned really in the last decades of research is that if we define culture as I have, everything we learn from others, then learning from others, and sometimes that learning extends into forming traditions, and therefore we're talking about culture in the sense I've defined it, well, that's really quite widespread in the animal kingdom. And this is really a discovery of recent decades of hard-won research. So I'm going to be talking about all these species shown here, at least briefly today. But I'm going to start by talking about chimpanzees, which is a species, our closest relatives, of course, the animal that I've studied quite a lot. And I first wrote about what I called the second inheritance system of chimpanzees in this special issue of the journal Nature, which reported the chimpanzee genome. This was a few years after reporting the human genome. And so you can probably appreciate the contrast. The idea of the chimpanzee genome is, well, that's the primary first source of inheritance, the backbone of evolution. But at least some species, and here I talked about chimpanzees, have a second inheritance system where what's inherited comes through learning from others. So let me start off by talking a bit about primates, and particularly our research with chimpanzees that will explain what I mean by this second inheritance system. A few years ago, I was very fortunate, well, honored really, to be the first author of this paper, co-authored with all the leaders of the long-term chimpanzee research study sites across Africa. And it's worthwhile emphasizing that just say 50 years ago, certainly 60 years ago, we knew next to nothing about the behavior of our closest living relative on the planet. How disgraceful. After all those eons of history and prehistory, we still didn't know how they behaved. It all began to change when Jane Goodall went to the Gombe Stream Reserve and started observing chimpanzees, and then others followed her, so that over the years, researchers have studied chimpanzees long-term at sites right from West Africa, the green over there, to East Africa, the blue mark there. Here you can see Gombe Stream, Jane Goodall's research site. And what they started to see was that chimpanzees behaved in different ways across Africa, as of course people do, and started to suspect, could this be due to culture? Well, if you watch chimpanzees, the young often very closely observe what the adults are doing, so that suggests that there may be something in that idea. And in this paper, we finally put together all the research up to the end of the century, and at that point, all these different research groups could put together 150 years of observations of chimpanzees across Africa. To cut to the chase, what we discovered was that chimpanzees display at least 39 cultural variations, as we call them, or traditions across Africa. And each of these panels here represents those 39 possibilities. What we were looking at was behaviors that we found were really customary, very common or habitual at least one location, and yet they were absent at another one, at least one, without, so far as we could see, any easy environmental explanation for that or a genetic one. So that's what we meant by a local cultural variant or tradition, and they're the ones that are lit up here on each of these panels. And you can see that that makes the panels look different. I don't have time to illustrate all of these, there are 39 here, and we've discovered more since. But let me just show you one or two. So I blow them up. You can see just from the names of some of them, you can perhaps guess what they are. An important thing is that they really span most of the repertoire of chimpanzees, various ways of processing their food, using tools, sometimes to help get food or deal with the food, social behavior, even grooming techniques. So just to give you one little example as a taster, if chimpanzees are grooming another and they get one of those ectoparasites off, what do they do with it? Well, if they're a chimpanzee in West Africa, they'll put it on their forearm and they'll squash it. That's dispatching the little parasite. But if they're in West Africa, they're much more, in East Africa, they're much more likely to take a leaf. They take a leaf and they put the thing on it as if it's like a Petri dish, and they inspect it. And then they decide, well, maybe they crush it in the leaf, or they get rid of it, or they eat it. But they use a leaf for that, whereas the ones over in the West do something different. And then there's even courtship gambits that were in our list. So I don't have time to illustrate all of them, but let me just show you a couple. One is called pestle pound, and that only happens in Bossou in West Africa. Here's a chimpanzee doing it. They're climbing to the top of a palm tree, and then they're using one of the big fronds to beat into the growing point, because they've taken all they can from the growing point, and by doing this, they create a kind of mush, a soup, which means they can get much more of this nutritious material out of the top of the palm tree. That helps them get them through the dry season, it's been found. So that just happens at this one site here, Bossou, right over in the west, you can see there, and it doesn't happen elsewhere, despite the fact there are palm trees. But something else that happens over in the west, both at Bossou and at the other site mentioned here, Thai forest, is using stones to crack nuts. And this map here shows some of the more detailed analysis is done recently, showing the different ways in which chimpanzees do that, even at different sites within West Africa. But you can see it's a fairly small area. There was one report of one over in Cameroon a few years ago, but that's not been identified. So it's important and interesting that it doesn't occur in the rest of Africa. I think we can see just some examples of that, hammering a nut on the ground or in a tree, which is a bit more tricky, using a heavy stone to crack a really hard nut. And this just shows, it's tricky. It's sometimes a bit frustrating. And in fact, it takes years to get it right, because it's not just a question of smashing that nut. If you really smash it, well, you just get a powder. So you've got to crack the shell and yet be able to get the nut inside. Still, there's a question there about this and all the other behaviors, really. Well, are they really socially learned traditions? The fact that they differ in the ways we've described across Africa, well, maybe we've missed some key environmental difference between the ones in the East and the West, which explain why just some of them nut crack, or maybe it's an instinct in the West African ones, not the East African ones. So let's focus on that behavior and just look at some of the more detailed evidence that's come in since that helps to pin down exactly what's going on. One is to go to other parts of Africa, as Bill McGrew did, to go to Gabon, which is just off the map here, but in Central Africa, where chimpanzees don't crack nuts. And he found, as did Christoph Bursch, going to another location right over quite near to the area where nut cracking happens, but on the east of a very large river where it just doesn't seem to cross, and found that chimpanzees don't nut crack there, but all the materials are there. The nuts are there, the hammer materials as well. Of course, a human can crack the nuts, but the chimpanzees don't do it. So a simple environmental explanation seems to be something we should put aside. And that's really underlined by this more recent study looking at these three neighboring groups of chimpanzees illustrated here in the Thai forest, all of whom, of course, crack nuts. But they're living in essentially the same kind of habitat. There's gene flow between them. So neither genes nor environment can explain the fact that if you look in a bit more detail, in this case, at the proportion of their nut cracking that involves a stone hammer as opposed to a wooden one, here's a little graph to illustrate that. For two of these communities, you can see these curves here, showing that it varies by season. But for one group, it doesn't. They steadfastly stick to a high rate of using stone tools. That's what they like to do as a community right through the year. And then finally, we can add to this experimental evidence, which is often the strongest that we can have. And to do this, we went to East Africa, to a community of chimpanzees here that are not in the middle of the lake swimming about there, on an island sanctuary, which meant we felt it was ethical to do the research we did, which was to expose them to nuts and see what they did. Of course, these are East African chimpanzees, remember, who don't nut crack. So when we exposed 7 juveniles to the nuts in phase 1 of our study, they didn't do anything. So in phase 2, we exposed half of them to a model who knew what to do. This is the 6-year-old on the right, but watch the little guy on the left. You can see just the way he's really engaging with what's going on, and even what we've described it as entraining on the same behavior, and consistent with that. That's Buluku here. He was one of the ones exposed in this way, and of those 4, 3 then started nut cracking. And then in phase 3, we exposed all of them to the nut cracking, and all of them started nut cracking, particularly ones who had already done it, so that they started doing it even more and starting to master it. So if we put all this evidence together, we think we've got strong evidence for this second inheritance system, that chimpanzees can and do learn this kind of behavior, and that then creates these different traditions across Africa, in this case, just nut cracking over in the far west. Well, there's still a question then there about, well, can chimpanzees actually sustain these traditions? Will they actually spread across a whole group, as we predict they would, and maybe even from group to group? So we've tested this not with nut cracking, but various other challenges we've given chimpanzees, in which, as in this experiment, we take 2 groups of chimpanzees who can't see each other, they're the little circles here. We present them all with the same problem, and in this case it's quite naturalistic, the kind of thing that happens to them in the wild. There's some food they want, in this case it's a grape, it's behind some blockage, but they can get it if they use a stick tool. But what we do is show just one chimpanzee here, the blue one, we take it aside, and without the other seeing, we show it that you could use your stick tool to lift that blockage up out of the way, and you can see then the grape will roll forward and the chimp will get it. But there's a little flap here. So this chimpanzee over here, this green marked one, we show her a completely different way to do it, which is to get your stick in the hole at the front, push the blockage backwards, which doesn't come easily to a chimpanzee to push food away from you. But we teach her, if you do that, you'll knock the grape off the back and it will roll forward and you'll get it. So then we have these 2 chimpanzee experts who know how to solve this problem, but in 2 completely different ways. And then we'll reunite them with the rest of their group, thanks to my daughter, who's quite good with a pencil. And so the others can come and watch. And this is what we call an open diffusion experiment. So it's open to who can come and watch and whether anything will happen. And the question is, will the others then start to do the behavior that we're trying to sort of seed in each group and see whether it spreads differently? Well, the short answer to that is it did. But before I show you the results for that, what I want to do is just jump on quickly to a slightly more complicated version of that experiment, where we're asking, will chimpanzees be able to transmit traditions from group to group, which is what we're inferring is happening in the wild in Africa. So here, in a big community in Texas, we had 3 groups there, B1, B2, B3, who could all see the neighbors through big windows. You can probably just make those out in the photo at the top. And then 3 other groups, B4 to B6, who could also see their neighbors through big windows, but they couldn't see the other 3 groups. And then it's the same idea as the experiment I've just described. We've got one method up there, the stab technique. You can see you open up a hole at the top and put your stick in, stab the food and pull it out. And we introduced that to the chimpanzees at point 1 over here, just one chimpanzee. And then one chimpanzee over here in group B4, we showed them to do it the other way. So it's the same problem they've got, but they do it in a different way. So the question is, well, would it spread across that first group, B1 in one case, B4 in the other? Here's a little graph showing it, color-coded. Here's the poke at the top and the other model chimpanzee not quite so active but doing the slide technique, what happens? Well, let's run it across the group. Well, as you can see, already we get two little traditions forming, except there's one chimp, you see this guy here, the dark one there, has actually worked out for themselves that you could do it the other way that we'd seeded in the other group. And that's the stab technique, which, for anyone who knows chimpanzees, that may be a more chimpy, natural kind of way to do it. So we might expect that if we run it across all three groups, then they'll all end up doing the same thing, stab. But that's not what happened. If we run the whole sequence, we find, to the contrary, let's look at this group here, the final group here, which we seeded with this slide technique over here. Well, that's all that group are doing. So, and it was the most common behavior all the way along, except that, of course, there were these occasional, what we might call corruptions, but there's something about the way chimpanzees transmit these behaviors that kind of rode over those little perturbations. And if I show those data just in a different way, so in this picture here, each block there is one of those chimpanzees. It's just the same data shown in a different way. And I do that because we then did it with a more complicated task and got basically the same result. You can see the difference between the blue on one side, the green on the other. And then we even did it at other places, like the Yerkes Center in Atlanta. And we get the same kind of effect with different kind of challenges we're giving the chimps. Here's the panpipes. That was the one I started showing you earlier on. The one seeded with poke, and they all do poke. And then the slightly less natural thing for chimpanzees, showing them how to lift. Well, most of them still pick that up, even though a few work out, well, I prefer to do this poke behavior. Okay, here are chimpanzees doing this hand-clasp grooming, where they each put one hand up like this and groom the other one underneath. It just developed spontaneously in one group and then spread over 2 or 3 years. Never happened in the other group. And interestingly, this corresponds with what we see in the wild, where this behavior has emerged and become customary in the Mahale Mountains in Tanzania, and yet just less than a couple of 100 miles away in Gombe Stream Reserve, where Jane Goodall studies chimpanzees, it's never been seen. So that corresponds to that. So if we put all this information together, we think we've got strong evidence here that chimpanzees can sustain these traditions for some while, and they will pass not only within a group, but across it. And consistent with that, here's an excavation in the wild at that Thai forest site, and Christoph Busch, who's the leader of that group, which excavated down to a level that they could date to over 4,000 years ago. And here he's showing are all the nut-cracking materials that chimpanzees must have been using 4,000 years ago, and it continues. It's just the same as we find on the surface here as a result of contemporary chimpanzees doing this behavior. So this can have long-term substantial effects. But that's not true of all of what results from this second inheritance system of learning from others, because some of the results of what we call social learning, learning from others, can be quite transient. And here's a kind of image to illustrate what we've called a kind of cultural pyramid. At the base of this is this behavior of learning from others. For example, bees, we know, will learn from other bees. Oh, that's a good flower to go to right now. But that is obviously only transient information. It will only be relevant for perhaps a few hours, a few days, and then it won't be. It's only when behavior becomes much more common, spreads across a group, like I've just been describing, then we could call it a tradition. And it may go on for some time, perhaps even across generations and across different groups. One example of that is birdsong, illustrated there. But then we've made this distinction, there's a third level in the pyramid, when we get multiple tradition cultures. Because it could be that in these birds who sing different dialects in different areas, as I'll explain a bit more in a moment, perhaps that's all they do, just kind of one-trick cultural ponies, we might say. Whereas in the case of the chimpanzees, we've got these multiple tradition cultures, which seems one step further towards the complications we see in the human case. But then in the human case, we have this top layer here, what we call cumulative culture, because our cultures are very special in the way that they build up on what went before. Okay, we all stand on the shoulders of those who went before, and we have complicated cultures like, everything we see in this room. In fact, in our lifetimes, we've seen the cultural evolution of digital technology, for example. So with that introduction, let's look at some other species. After our chimp study, other researchers came along looking at orangutans and established something very similar. And just this very year, a study by all the gorilla researchers has put together all their information and reported something very similar. In fact, each of these reported a couple of dozen different traditions across the ranges of the animals they studied. And it's not just apes. I'll just give one example from monkeys. Okay, here's a monkey over this side of the pond in Central America, in this case, these spider monkeys, which to some extent are inhabiting a kind of chimpanzee niche in the New World. And this study by Claire Santarelli and others showed 22 different traditions identified in the same way and even portrayed in the same way as we had originally done. So that's all I'll say about primates, the study that I mainly study. Let me give you a few more examples that other researchers at this conference have been talking about, one way or the other. And I'm going to put together two groups, other mammals, the whales and dolphins, and birds, because these two groups actually share two characteristics which we don't really see in primates, but which give us evidence of this second inheritance system. One is they sing complicated songs, and the other thing is they sometimes migrate very large distances, sometimes halfway around the world, which chimpanzees don't do. Okay, and here's a quotation from the authors of the cetacean book on whales and dolphins, from Hal Whitehead, who's with us here at the conference, was speaking this morning, and my colleague Luke Rendell back in St Andrews. They came to the conclusion that culture is perhaps a major part of what the whales are, a really sort of major and recent discovery. Last century we heard almost nothing about this. But we did hear more about the birds, so let's move on to them. Birds sing different songs or variations on their songs, dialects, in different areas. Here's just one illustration of that. These little diagrams here are what are called sonograms or sonographs, which give you a visual representation of the frequencies of the song over time. And I think you can see that they all are somewhat similar. They are white-crowned sparrow songs. If you're an ornithologist, you perhaps recognize that. But I think you can also see that they must be different. They sound just subtly different. They're different dialects, the way that we humans speak different dialects in different parts of the places we live. And in this recent book that puts together all this information, that's just one example. There are over 80 different studies showing these birdsong dialects. When you think what high proportion of bird species are songbirds, well, we're probably talking about something like 4,000 species of birds in the world who are showing this kind of cultural phenomenon. And it's not only that they vary in space, in how they sing, but it changes over time as well. So these researchers could recognize these particular individuals. Each of these is a different bird in a consecutive generations, and you can see the way in which the song was, as it were, inherited from the father in this case, was recognizably somewhat similar, and yet diverged in generations, as we see here, 3 different variants emerging over time, a kind of cultural evolution, or at least a cultural change, that the authors describe by analogy with genetic change as cultural mutations rather than genetic mutations in their songs. They sing very complicated songs. So humpback whales in particular are very complicated. It's made up of a number of different themes, and you can see from those sonographs it's made up of different phrases, each one made up of different notes or different elements. And I'm just going to show you one illustration, again, of the ways in which these can change not only in space, but over time. And that's a study we heard about this morning from someone else at the conference, Ellen Garland. And what she has done here is color code songs. The pale blue ones all sound essentially the same, and they're a variant on the dark blue one that came before. And what they've found is that these songs they're picked up on the coast of Australia, right over here, and then they gradually drift over several years right across the Pacific Ocean to French Polynesia. And you can see the pale blue ones drifting across there. If we play the sequence further, well, whoops. Next came the dark red ones, and then the bright red ones, which are a variant on the red type, and then the yellow, and then the green. Extraordinary event. So At each point here, at each location, the song changes sometimes quite dramatically in a kind of revolutionary way. But then once it's changed, everyone sings, as it were, from the same hymn sheet. They all sing the same song. Extraordinary results. Then there's migration. Many species of whales migrate halfway around the world like this. And what's been discovered is that the young ones go with their mother on the first trip. They follow her, and sometimes they also follow her on the way back. But at any rate, they always go with her on the first trip, and then that route that they've apparently picked up is laid down for the rest of their lives. So again, strong circumstantial evidence for this second inheritance system driving traditions, in this case, of the migratory routes they use for the rest of their lives. That kind of diagram, we could have drawn a similar diagram for many species of migratory birds, because many birds migrate, and some also, again, halfway around the world or further. And it's also been found that the young will often follow their parents, and therefore, it would appear, pick up that route from them and stick to that for the rest of their lives. But we know there are other species with whom that's not the case. Think about cuckoos. Cuckoos can't benefit in that way from their genetic parents. And they seem to have something in their head that tells them roughly the way to fly and how far. So it would be nice if we had perhaps some experimental evidence to see, well, those ones who do follow their parents actually learn from them, and that's how they pick up the behavior. And what I've realized is that there are not exactly studies, not scientific experiments. I think these are endeavors that are done for conservation purposes. What I'm referring to is the way that some young birds are imprinted on microlight aircraft, which then become their surrogate parents, and they will follow those. You've probably seen pictures like this, and you might recognize the pilot up there, certain Mr. Putin. So I was wondering if your glorious new president might start to compete with us, and we'll see him in such an endeavor. I don't know. But here are cranes on the left and some geese on the right here, following their surrogate parents, and that in the way then shows that, yes, that's the route they will pick up, and they will follow that in future years. So a kind of experiment, although not done for scientific purposes. And then just a couple of other examples, one from birds and one from whales, about the acquisition of foraging techniques. Another one we heard about from Lucy Applin, who was with us this morning, talking about exactly this experiment, actually. These little great tits are all marked in a population in a big wood, Whiten wood near Oxford. And what they did was study several communities that were marked in this way, but into each community they introduced, just rather in the same way we did that with the chimpanzees, showing a model of how to crack nuts. In this case, it was a great tit who either knew to press this thing here, the red side to the left, and get a mealworm out, or press the blue side to the right instead and getting a mealworm out. So you have pink experts and blue experts, if you like. And what this graph shows here is the way that these behaviors spread, either in the blue or pink-seeded community, compared with this information here, which is birds who have no benefit of a model. Later they pick it up, but much more slowly. What's extraordinary, however, is if you look at the graph on the right at the top there, the two groups seeded with the blue method, they're the ones who show nearly all blue behavior, as it were. And the three on the right, which were seeded with the pink, that's really what they do. So a strong fidelity to what was seeded in that group. It spreads across the group. And even as this bottom graph shows here, this is one season and then the second season where it continues. In fact, in this case, it looks to be even stronger. And in this case as well, season 1, season 2, for those who are seeded with this blue behavior. So simple behavior here, but a quite strong set of traditions being established in this way. And this has to do with foraging. And there's been other experiments in which there's cross-fostering, and blue tits, for example, and great tits, two different species, the eggs are swapped. And then it's found that the young ones start to adopt the foraging techniques and other things, including even the sexual preferences of the birds that they're then being reared by. Well, of course, you can't do these kind of experiments with the whales, but very careful observations can still get at the cultural evolution. In this case, what's called lobtail feeding. So a couple of decades ago, this behavior was first observed just in 1 or 2 whales. And in this, the whale smacks the flukes on the surface, and it makes the ball of fish they're hunting below, I think, sort of hugged together probably makes it easier to hunt. And over, as you see, 27 years and over 70,000 sightings by scientists and volunteers working with them, they've logged that in over 600 whales, this behavior gradually spread over time. And the way in which it spread is the kind of signature, well, it was transmitted by this second inheritance system of social learning, because it's those animals who hang out more together, which is illustrated in this social network diagram here. The blue ones are the ones that are at the center of the social network, and they're the ones who've picked up the behavior, the lobtail feeding, the blue dots. The diffusion, as it were, followed the pathways of who hangs out with whom. So strong circumstantial evidence for social learning. So that's a quick run through. What have we had? Two major groups of mammals, birds. Just one slide for fish. Here's a quote from my colleague Kevin Leyland. There's actually better evidence for culture in fish than in primates, he said. And he said this when he came up to join our research group in St Andrews, and he's still with us. We now collaborate, even though this kind of comment didn't exactly get our relationship off to a flying start, because I'm a primatologist. But because he was right, because with fish like these, you can actually do experiments where you can even take a whole community of them and move them to another part of the reef. You can do corresponding experiments in the lab which have been done, which have shown, again, because you can't really do that with chimpanzees, you certainly can't do it with sperm whales, with that kind of experiment that has shown that these animals will pick up the route of the animals they're then linked up with, and they will follow that for years. I think one experiment went on for 12 years, and they continued that new tradition they'd been introduced to. But that's the only one I'll show, because I want finally, how am I doing for time? I want finally to get on to an example from insects. So we're now going on to invertebrates, and an example from insects, just one. But it's a rather beautiful recent one, which again we heard about today. And it follows the same kind of procedure that Lucy Aplin one with the great tits did, of training models, or that we did with our chimpanzees, training a model to nutcrack. In this case, the bee is doing a fairly extraordinary thing. Here's the model. It's been trained to pull this string, and by pulling the string, it pulls this artificial flower out, and it can get at the nectar, a nectar substitute that's in the middle there. And then in the little diagrams on the left here, at the top of the first three, there's a yellow dot. That's the expert bee. And what happened was that all the other bees that are marked with the orange dots, they were the ones who could observe this bee, and they picked up the behavior. So what you're seeing in those diagrams is the social network. Each line shows where the bee was getting its information from the yellow bee initially. And the other three diagrams here are communities that had no model, so they never discovered the behavior. And there's even, you can probably see a pink one. There's one down here, for example. This pink one didn't learn from the first bee, the yellow one. It learned from one or more of these orange-marked bees that were the second ones to learn it. And there's even one or two blue ones like this, marked in this way, that were the next, as it were, cultural generation. So if we say, well, the first model is the first generation, then the orange is the second, the pink the third, and the blue the fourth cultural generation in a little sort of sequence of cultural transmission. So here we have not only evidence of this second inheritance system in bees, but also evidence of real cultural transmission, cultural spread. Extraordinary, nice results. And we get some other evidence of this now coming out in the last year or two for other insects too. What we don't know, however, is how much this actually corresponds with what's going on in the wild, and like some of the evidence I've talked about for some other kinds of animals. So in the temperate climates, bees like this all tend, the workers die off. In the winter, there's just the queen remaining. She knows nothing of what the rest of our hive might have developed as some sort of smart tradition like this. It would be really interesting to discover more about tropical bees who go through the year, and there may be more continuity there from year to year, and perhaps long-term traditions in insects too. So we're still in a major sort of phase of discovery. What I've done so far is try and illustrate that first claim I want to make in this talk, that social learning and cultural transmission are very widespread in animals. Certainly social learning of the kind I've just described is widespread. I mean, if it applies to all insects, I guess it probably will. And that's a very large proportion of the animal kingdom. Maybe cultural transmission, as I said, thinking about the bees, still needs to be more fully demonstrated. But in very many groups of vertebrates, it seems to be a reality. And in some species, it's really quite widely pervading in their lives. That was the claim for the whales, you remember, and I would make the same for the great apes at least. So that then raises two other questions which are questions which we're addressing in this scientific colloquium. So I'll just sort of quickly run through those before I finish. The first one is, well, can this kind of cultural transmission give rise not only to a second form of inheritance, but to a second form of actual evolution? I mean, that's clear in the human case. I've already mentioned, we've seen the evolution of digital technology in our lifetimes, and the whole of human history is exemplifying many cases of the cumulative evolution of more and more complicated cultural manifestations. What about these animal cases, which don't perhaps accumulate in that way, but they certainly change in various ways? And then the final question then is, how do these different cultural systems interact? Does the cultural system interact with the genetic system? Does it influence genes and the rest of organic evolution? And what about the other side of that equation? So cultural transmission certainly gives rise to the second form of evolution in humans. And in this paper by Alex Massoudi, who's also with us at the meeting, we'll be talking tomorrow, in fact, kind of updating this analysis done also in collaboration with myself and Kevin Leyland, who's also co-organizer of this meeting. What we did here was go back to the origin of species and identify the main principles that were set out there and say, well, what's the evidence that they really are in place in the case of human cultural evolution? Well, in short, we find plenty of evidence that they are. So let's look at animal cultures from the same point of view, and nobody's really done this before, so this is really just us starting to explore this question. We take the first three things here. I mean, this is really the essence of Darwinian evolution. Okay, you've got some variations can be inherited, so given you've got competition and selection within that variation, then what comes through is going to be the things inherited, and you get some gradual evolution. It's only recently, really, that we've seen many examples of evolution in action in the real world. And, of course, there are classic cases like this one. You perhaps know about if you've done any sort of high school biology, the peppered moth. Because of human interventions in the world, in this case, blackening the world with soot at a certain stage in our history, from a previous stage where the white version of this moth was the one that was best camouflaged on things like birch trees and the like, we shifted to a situation where it was good to be dark, and then that was selected for and became the common form. But then later, as we've managed to clean up the world, it swung back again to favour the white version. So evolution can often take a very long time, but when things like this happen, we can see it in action over a much shorter period of time. So I began to think, well, how might we see that in the case of social learning? And we can here benefit from the fact that social learning and cultural transmission can be much faster. So let's just look at this little experiment, which didn't take all that long, done by Emil Menzel a few years ago, where he took 3 young chimpanzees and he exposed them to 2 objects which are slightly anxiety-making. There was a swing, and there was another object which rolled along by itself, which they seemed to find even more frightening to begin with, so they wouldn't go near it. And what they did was make those 3 chimpanzees the first in a series there. Let's call them A, B, C. And then in the second month of the experiment, they took one of those chimpanzees out and they put another one in. So now we have B, C, D. And then they kept doing that every second month, so that after they'd done it 3 times, it was a totally new little set of chimpanzees, a triplet of chimpanzees, different from the first lot. And yet they saw change along this sequence. And if we follow the whole thing, it looks like this. So to begin with, they won't go near the object, and this shows that gradually they reach a stage where then, after here, they all did. But in this middle stage, really what's happening is that some are more bold than others. That's okay, because these objects aren't really dangerous. Others watch this, see this, they pick up the behavior, and then it gradually spreads to the group, and then they pass it on, even though these these triplets here are a completely different set from the ones over here who were first learning it. And recently we've got evidence of a similar kind of thing happening in the wild. Some of my other colleagues, Klaus Zuberbuehler, here's Catherine Hobater, and Kat is here with some of the habituated chimpanzees in the Budongo forest in Uganda. And at the same time they were studying them, they started habituating a second group, neighbouring group. But those chimpanzees were taking quite a while to habituate and get used to the humans until two of these habituated chimpanzees moved into that group, and then suddenly the habituation went very quickly. So I think what was happening here is the kind of process that was happening here. The other chimpanzees were learning that actually it's okay to be bold and be near these humans. They're not actually dangerous. So here I think we've got evidence of the next thing in the list, adaptation, because the objects aren't really dangerous, the people aren't dangerous, so it's a good thing to learn this. And what we're talking about here is the evolution and selection amongst, not individuals being more successful than the others, we're not talking about survival and reproduction of individuals, but survival and reproduction of the cultural variations, what Richard Dawkins has called memes. We've got with us Dan Dennett, who's very keen on that way of thinking about these things as kind of analogies to genes. But adaptation can take different forms. Here's one adaptation to the environment. These macaques, if you look at the ones on the right there, are using rocks to smash shellfish on the seashore or prize them off rocks, something that's only been discovered relatively recently, and that allows those monkeys to invade this intertidal zone, which those monkeys wouldn't normally do. Others seem to adapt to the demands of what's called sexual selection. That's to say, females have certain preferences for certain songs, and males have been shown in certain studies to adapt their song to be attractive to the ladies. So that's adaptation to the female preferences. And then finally, another example here, adaptation to social life. Susan Perry, another person at the conference, studied this bizarre behavior, or to humans it's bizarre, where these white-faced capuchins will do things like sticking their fingers up each other's noses and even into their eyeballs. Why? Well, it seems to demonstrate the strength of the bonds between them. I mean, you have to really trust another monkey, right, to allow it to put its finger right in your eyeball or right up your nose and so on. So, and that's something that emerged, diffused, and then in some groups it faded away. So it certainly wasn't an instinct. What next? Accumulation of modifications. Well, this is where it's often said, well, this is the big divide between ourselves and others. We have this cumulative culture I've talked about. Other species don't. Well, I think that's a bit premature to think that, because what we've got here is a rather complex sequence in which chimpanzees are going to hunt. You've probably seen them termiting on the TV, where they take stems like this and hunt in termite mounds. But they're going to go for subterranean termite mounds. And they're going to use a thick stick they've left here, first of all, to make a tunnel. So he's cleaning up the stick, making a little mark where he wants to make the tunnel, and then he's going to push that stick in, digging like this. It feels like me digging my garden, right? And they're going down, actually, something like 2 feet to make a tunnel down to the subterranean nest. What they've all got in their mouths is stems that they've brought to the site that they're then going to fish with. So they knew what they were going to do before they came. They collected these on their way there, but they have to spend some time making these deep tunnels. I think one thing that's remarkable here, and it only happens here in this particular Central African site, is, they know what to do. I mean, there's nothing to see there. But of course, what you can do, and presumably we think this behaviour has built up over time, from perhaps starting to do it quite close to the surface, to do it where you're going down a couple of feet in a completely opaque situation. But by copying what others do, you can do it. Now they've sat down to do further complications, which is they're fashioning the tools. They're taking those stems, stripping them through their teeth to make a brush tip on the end. That makes them very good to fish. The termites grab onto that. It's tricky to get them down the tunnel, but they do it. So they're all cooperating in that. Okay, and then we've also got evidence of these other things on our list. Geographic distribution, we've already seen in the bird song. What's called convergent evolution in these primates that are not necessarily very closely related. The chimpanzees, capuchins, and long-tailed macaques, they've all, in different parts of the world, invented using tools to crack their foods. And finally, change of function, something we see in cultural evolution where things change their function over time. Well, these Japanese macaques started washing their sweet potatoes to get the grit off many years ago. And then gradually they've shifted. So they take them into the sea, and then they bite them, and then they dip them in the sea again. And so they salt them between bites. And that's not, presumably that's not just a sort of trivial thing about them tasting nice, but they get the mineral from that. They get the salt in from that. And they've even taken to doing other things now. They actually swim, some of them, and eat fish, which is sort of further complications along the line. So I think there is some evidence of perhaps each of these, not to such an elaborate way as we see in humans, but we see some of them. So I can see I'm nearly running out of time, but I just wanted then finally to talk a little bit about this last issue, which is a big and complicated one, and we're only starting to kind of scratch the surface about this in this meeting. But the links between these traditional behaviors and evolution at large, as it were, including organic evolution. The first point is simply that traditional behaviors, like the ones I talked about at Bosu, really have impact on reproductive success. So here we're not talking about evolution of the behaviors and the selection of behaviors and their evolution, but the individuals who do them. It matters for them. That actually has been shown to be what gets them through the dry season in this area. They couldn't live there unless they were this kind of cultural creature. And then just a very different example. Birdsong also affects reproductive success. A reed warbler like this, if he can manage to sing a big and complicated song, the ladies will like that, and he'll have more reproductive success. And so that leads us on to a second issue here, which is sexual selection on such cultural behavior. The way that females respond may shape the actual reproductive success of birds like this. Then the last 2 points, these are big issues, but I have to deal with them fairly briefly. I've called this behavioral drive. Some have then gone on to call it cultural drive. The idea here, it's sometimes referred to, or variations of this are called the Baldwin effect, where what happens is that behavior allows animals with some kind of flexibility, plasticity, to invade an environment or a habitat which is somewhat new for them. That allows them to get in there, and then once they start, as it were, invading that niche, then there's a selection pressure on various aspects of their organic being, which may be shaped as a result. So the idea here is, in this case, it may be culture that leads them into this, and then there's pressure for organic change. So just one little example of this, Carol van Schaik and I have written about what we call the cultural intelligence hypothesis, which we really initially put forward to try and explain why the great apes are as intelligent as they are and as large-brained as they are, and there's various other explanations for large brain size and so on, which don't seem to work in the case of the great apes. But one thing the great apes share, as I mentioned before, is these rather complex cultures made up of multiple traditions, and we suggested that that might be one reason why they're more generally intelligent and have larger brains. And recently a study came out supporting this, cognitive differences between orangutan species, the two different species of orangutans. Let's go back to that. The Sumatran orangutan seems to have the more complex cultures made up of multiple traditions, more so than the Bornean one. And studies in zoos have shown that they seem to express the greater general intelligence, which it's been suggested would allow them to, as it were, benefit from that and practice and fully acquire all the things they can learn through their cultures. And their brains are just a little bit, but significantly larger than the Bornean cousins. And that leads me on to the final point here, culturally driven genetic differences. There's some evidence for this in the case of birdsong. So the eminent researchers, the Grant husband and wife team, studied the Galapagos finches and showed that because they differ, for example, in those dialects and other aspects of their behavior, it becomes more and more difficult for them to actually interbreed. And so you get incipient and perhaps ultimately speciation. And the people working on cetaceans, and this is something we heard about more this morning, argue the same thing for them as well. So just one example of that is killer whales, illustrated here. They display various what are called ecotypes. They have very different clans of them have very different ways of hunting. For example, some just eat fish, others eat seals, and they've got very clever ways of tipping seals off ice floes and getting them in cooperative ways. And those clans may also sing different songs. Some are rather resident and stay in certain places. Others move around more. And it means that if you're one of those clans which are culturally different to the other guys, then it becomes more difficult to actually transfer. I mean, if you know how to eat fish, hunt fish, and then you go and join the others, and they're off doing all this seal stuff, well, how can you really integrate with that and breed there? So that may drive genetic differences, and we see increasingly research papers entitled like this, that cultural traditions shape the genetic structure of different populations of whales. This is other research done by a team in St Andrews. So we're seeing more and more of this. And this is the kind of issue that we are exploring in this meeting. We've had some of this today. We have more tomorrow. We're shifting from talking about non-human animals today to talking more about the human case tomorrow. I've really concentrated on the animal story today. So this really does extend what we've known before, because what's sometimes called the modern synthesis, the synthesis of understanding genetics and what essentially Darwin discovered, was really done in the 1930s and 40s. And all this research I've been talking about describes discoveries made in the second half of the last century, and indeed much of it really accelerated in the last couple of decades. Yet you can look at many textbooks like these by famous workers in evolution, and some of them really quite recent, but you can search in them in vain for anything about the kind of story that I've been telling you, that kind of material. So we think there's perhaps a significant gap there that may be filled by the scientific explorations we're pursuing at this meeting. Some books do have, this one, for example, has like a half page on chimps, half page on the bird song, very good, but that's in a massive book. And a book like this by famous evolutionists, particularly John Maynard Smith, talks about the major transitions in evolution. And okay, the last one is the emergence of culture, but it's human culture they talk about here. There's not really any acknowledgement that there may be something called animal culture. So I hope I've persuaded you that perhaps there is something called animal culture, and it's quite widespread. So my thanks finally go to all my co-authors and collaborators. I'm just going to show you a long list here because I haven't really talked that much about my research, but we do a lot. There's a lot of us. And these are all the various organizations that have funded our research. So thank you to them. I will put by at the back there, I realised I'd forgotten to do it, there's a list of our recent publications. For anyone who really wants to look into that, you could do that. But I think that's me done. Thank you.